Okay, so we're up and running now. I think we're recording. I can see that recording button going. So welcome everybody to the second of the departmental talks on COVID. Couple of things going on at my end. I'm recording this and we may get cut off because my internet connection's not been particularly good. It's not good across North London for the past couple of days. I'm not sure why. If we do get cut off, I'll record it by talking to myself, which I've done before, and record it, and then we can upload onto the site so you can listen at your own leisure. The second thing to say is that I've also got electricians in the house just now, so hopefully they're not going to cut the electricity off. So again, if that happens, I'll record and put onto the site, the departmental site, and you can again listen at your own leisure. But I'm hoping they're not going to. None of that's going to happen. So I'll talk first for I don't know, about 40 minutes, I suppose, maybe slightly longer than that. And then after that, we can have a Q&A session. People can unmute their buttons after I've talked, and we can get into the Q&A. So I want to talk today about the economics of the coronavirus. Kind of topical idea, I suppose, in the sense that governments are trying to trade off the economic consequences with the saving of lives, and that's exactly what I want to talk about. And I want to go through that in terms of looking at the background to the COVID-19 infection, and then asking whether the lockdown response was economically justified in a sense, and then talk a little bit more about the long-term economic implications. The proviso on the last bit is, remember, I'm not a macroeconomist, and we have to get into macroeconomics a little bit to talk about that. So, that doesn't seem to work. The background, of course, is that we've got this set of coronaviruses which are pretty prevalent in bats. They tend to increasingly jump to humans, I think partly because humans are encroaching increasingly on natural territories, nature's territories, as we expand our urban areas in particular. COVID-19 is one coronavirus. It's related in that sense to SARS and MERS, which were earlier epidemics which affected the globe. And although we don't have full testing, and therefore we can't really say what the prevalence of COVID-19 is, the sort of rules of thumb are about where there is an infected population, about 20% of the infected population becomes classified as severe, so probably require some intervention of some sort, even if that's just isolation within their own houses. But the more severe ones go on to hospital, where about a third of them seem to be dying in ICUs. There might be long-term consequences associated with this, because it seems to be an infection which goes into a secondary mode and affects the other organs, in particular lungs and the kidneys. And of those severe cases, there's a death rate which ranges from about 0.7 to 3.4%. But again, we've not got much information over that. I'll come back to that later on in a moment. The other thing that's happening is, of course, coronaviruses are not alive in any sense. But they are strains which essentially hook onto a host, and as they hook onto the host, they may suffer decline through the immune system, and or they may mutate to try to live out their strain a little bit longer as the immune system of the host kicks in. And the Chinese scientists, where the infection first occurred, now believe that there may be two strains of the corona virus, COVID-19, in their population due to some quick mutation. They're not entirely sure about that. But of course, the big thing about it is it's deadly in a number of cases, and there are now about 3 million known cases globally, and about close to 250,000 deaths as of yesterday. And again, I'll come back to that as well later on. What's the dynamic of the infection? Well, the change, this delta in the infected population, as you probably know, is associated with the contact rate amongst the susceptible population, who, of course, give rise to an infected population. And that's essentially what gives the overall population, who at any point in time see a growth rate in the infected population. It's net out. We net out the recovery rate in the infected population, and that gives the overall net infected population rate. And these parameters, these contact rates within the susceptible population and the recovery rate within the infected population, give rise to this reproduction number, this famous R0, the reproduction rate, which of course has to fall below 1 for the infection rates to fall within any population. The impact of the lockdown can be introduced as a further parameter, this theta to the power, some power, but usually it's theta squared. The theta squared is essentially saying that the lockdown rate is going to have an impact upon an infection rate which is exponential. So that's why the lockdown rate has this power effect. So now the infected population rate of change, this delta in the infected population, becomes equal to the contact rate multiplied by the lockdown rate in the susceptible population, multiplied by the already infected population, again net off the recovery rate in the infected population. All right, so the reproduction rate can be calculated in different ways dependent on basically the data and the underlying model. And it can also be modelled deterministically, or it could be modelled in terms of it being stochastic. The imperial model is a deterministic model, I understand, so it doesn't take account of uncertainties in the underlying contact and recovery rates, but runs a number of simulations to try to get this reproduction number. The other thing to say about the reproduction number is that the contact rate, this beta, is obviously a social and economic parameter that reflects how populations interact, the population density, integration, age, infection, etc. And the lockdown rate, of course, is also a social and economic parameter. It depends partly on the harshness or the softness of the lockdown, and it also depends upon how the population respects the lockdown, as it's going to affect the susceptible population and how that interacts with a population that it infects. So, and then finally, of course, vaccination will affect the susceptible population, so it has a big impact because it comes into the susceptible population, and there are aspects associated with that which are quite important in terms of, for example, the herd immunity that might be accompanying the vaccination. So the dynamics of the infections are pretty well known in theory, but in terms of the modelling and the data associated with them, obviously, as it's the first pandemic of this sort, we don't have really great ideas about contact and recovery rates, especially as we don't have very much testing going on globally. We do in certain countries like South Korea, but it's not universal as of yet. I've taken a couple of graphs from the Financial Times website, which is quite a good website. It actually draws its underlying data from Johns Hopkins University, who are tracking the virus globally. Most of the graphs from the FT that I'll show you are similar in that they have a log scale. So notice that we're getting a doubling of this in this scale up here. And then they also have individual country rates. In this case, this is the numbers of new cases mapped from 0, where 0 is the days since the average daily case load first passed 30 cases. And then these stars are the various lockdowns. So as you can see, the lockdown in the UK occurred round about here, and that started to affect the rate of change in new cases, the slope of this line. And like a number of the countries who have enforced lockdown, we're beginning to see a kind of flattening off in the rate of new cases, which are now coming through into various populations. New cases, new infections. And it seems like we're getting a flattening out of new cases across many of the country's populations. South Korea I'll come back to again because they've probably had the most extensive testing program globally. New Zealand, of course, has had a very effective lockdown associated with the pandemic, and it's really managed to get a tight grip upon it. The death tolls are pretty high. The death tolls are again shown for the various countries on the FT website and associated with the lockdown. Again, it's a cumulative y-axis, a log scale on the y-axis. If we think about the US cumulative deaths, the cumulative deaths in the US which are attributed to COVID-19 are now higher than the cumulative deaths incurred by the US during the Vietnam War. So it's a massive impact on the country. For most of these countries, the cases and the death tolls appear to be associated largely with the urban areas, which maybe is not so surprising. And it is a truly global pandemic, of course, as you can tell from, again, this set of graphs for various countries. Indonesia is quite interesting, I think. Same y-axis, it's daily death tolls on a log scale, 0 since 30 days since the first infection was recorded. Indonesia was beginning to flatten off, but kind of rose again with the introduction of an easier lockdown where they allowed migrant labour back into the country. So they've had a kind of double hit after their lockdown was lifted. But again, seem to be getting it under some form of control from now. We don't really have great recording of either cases because we don't have great testing globally, or death rates because the death rates are always taking time to catch up. So a number of countries, the Office of National Statistics in the UK, for example, have been trying to look at the excess death rates against background deaths from previous years. So recent year death rates are, again, on a log scale here in the grey, and the excess deaths are in these red graph lines. And then the red numbers are the cumulative deaths associated with COVID-19. So we're beginning to see information which says that the background excess deaths over the background deaths are slightly higher. They seem to be higher than the death rates which are being reported. The death rates which are being reported are normally hospital death rates. The death rates go down over the weekend in most countries because the recording's not so good in the weekend. But increasingly people are aware that there are deaths occurring within the social care sector. And these social care deaths, first of all, because the contagion rates are very high, and also because it's an elderly population, they're adding somewhere between 10 to even 30% to the death rate, it seems, although that's not confirmed just now. So we don't know a lot about this this pandemic. We know some things. We don't know the precise death rate because testing's not been universal. And the excess death rate that we've just looked at there is a retrospective calculation, if you like, and it's still trying to catch up. We also don't know what the counterfactual of the lockdown is, what would have happened if we hadn't have had the lockdown. And therefore it's quite difficult to work out the full economic impact of the pandemic. But I want to turn to this now to try to see if we can. And if we are thinking about the impact that the economic impact that the lockdown has had, that of course relates to how many lives have been saved by the lockdown, and then whether we can put some kind of monetary value, a willingness to pay on the changing probability of death which is associated with the lockdown. So we need some probability of death from COVID, and of course that's very difficult to know, so we don't know the true underlying infection rate within a given population, and therefore we can only make guesses, as I did in the early slides, about the true infection fatality rate. Although it might be that we can get some information from some sources. So if you remember, there were a number of floating communities with no way out of the infection, essentially these cruise ships, a number of cruise ships which were infected fairly early on in the pandemic. And because they're enclosed populations, okay, you could have self-imposed lockdowns in cabins which may depress the numbers, but because they're self-contained and they're populations for which we do have good information, we might be able to get some kind of notion on the infection rate and the fatality rate from these cruise ships. So, for example, if we take one of the biggest, the Diana Princess cruise ship, it had 3,711 passengers and crew on it, of which 705 individuals were affected, which translates into approximately 20% severe infection rate. And the case fatality associated with that was about 1%. Now, of the countries which have carried out at least 10,000 tests, which is the ambition of the UK government by this Friday, of those countries which had carried out 10,000 tests by April the 22nd, the fatality rate is very wide. For the fatality rate for those who have tested positive in these tests lies between 0.1% in Singapore to 14.6% in Belgium, with an average of about 4%. And the general consensus is that because not all tests are particularly sensitive or particularly specific, and therefore there are a fairly high rate with some of the tests in terms of false positives, it's generally assumed that the fatality rate is towards the bottom end of that scale, and epidemiologists are now beginning to think that the fatality rate, case fatality rate, is round about 1%, about 0.99%, 1%, let's say. So if we can take this population, this confined population within these cruise ships as a basis for the infection rate and the case fatality rate, we could apply it to basic population. So here's an example applied to the United States and the UK. The United States on the left-hand side, the UK on the right-hand side of the screen. We take the US population, about 328, just over 328 million, 20% infected gives about 65 million infected, of which, if we take that case fatality rate of 1%, about 650,000 will die. And that's about the cumulative rate that we're already seeing, as I said just a while back. So it seems reasonable, at least. If we take the monetary value of life, a statistical life, generally speaking, when governments are undertaking public sector projects, they may look at whether or not, when they're building a new highway, for example, whether that highway reduces accidents and reduces case fatalities, accidents which result in death. And as part of the benefits of building highways, because there are less accidents on highways than on other roads, the government agencies attempt to put a valuation on a statistical death. So by looking at the reduction in the probability of death, the agency tries to put a value on the benefit of reducing traffic accidents by building highways, for example, and then gives a monetary value to that reduction in death. Sometimes through running surveys, essentially looking at population surveys where they ask individuals how much they'd be willing to pay for a reduction in a probability of an accident or a probability of a death by a car accident. Sometimes by looking at the reduction in the probability of a death associated with pollution, for example, and then again trying to evaluate through revealed preference surveys the amount of monies individuals would be willing to pay for a reduction in a probability of death. And in the US, the Environmental Agency and the Department of Transport Agency have come up with monetary values based on these reductions in the probability of death associated with pollution, in particular in urban areas, and the building of highways, somewhere around 10 million. So if we apply each statistical value of a life at 10 million to the figures that we have of who die based on the case fatality rate from these cruise liners, we get that the lockdown monetary value of the life saved is somewhere around 6.5, 6.3 trillion, depending on which value of life we use. Of course, with the lockdown, we still have about 60,000 deaths now, but even that netting out 50,000 still gets us to a net saving of somewhere around 6.5 to $6.29 trillion using these monetary values of life. So if that's true, that's the statistical life's monetary values in terms of the savings. If we apply that to the UK, then in the UK, we apply again the 20% infection rate, 1% case fatality rate. The Department of Transport values a British statistical life much lower than the Americans. So you'll be glad to know if you're British, you're only worth £1.8 million, which is roughly speaking about $2.5 million, much less than the American governments value their citizens' lives. But that's been pushed back recently by some researchers in Bath who have undertaken fairly extensive revealed preference surveys associated with the building of nuclear power plants and what would happen if there was any deaths associated with a meltdown. And their revealed preference surveys have come up with a value which is much closer to the US value of £8.5 million pounds per statistical life. So with the lockdown in the statistical lives, that would give us, without the lockdown rather, with a 20% infection rate and a 1% case fatality rate, the value of lives being around about 0.24 if we use this lower value of each life trillion, or 1.15 trillion if we use the higher value of a statistical life. And again, if we net out the deaths, we still have a net monetary value of lives at 0.24 trillion or 1.14 trillion. So we've got some valuation based on this case fatality rate from a confined population, which we can roll out. We can then say, well, what's the cost to the economies in the US and the UK of the lockdown? If we take the GDP of the US, it's about $21 trillion. In the UK, it's about 2.2 trillion. And the OECD has recently said that the cost of the lockdown is about 25% of GDP across all countries as a basic minimum figure. So 25% of these GDP figures gives us $5.38 trillion as the cost of the lockdown in the US, and about £0.55 trillion as the cost of the lockdown in terms of lost GDP in the UK. Now, if we take the value of lives as calculated in the previous slide as about 6.5 trillion, then obviously the lives saved by the lockdown have exceeded the cost of the GDP. So in that case, the economic recovery, if there is an economic recovery after the lockdown, then the value of life saved by the lockdown has exceeded the cost of locking the economy down in the US. If we take the UK figure, then it turns out that it depends very much on whether you're using the official very low figure of the value of a statistical life at 0.24 trillion, or you're using the higher recent revealed preferences gained by the researchers at VAT of 1.14 trillion pounds in the UK. So if there is an immediate economic recovery after 25% fall in GDP in the UK after the lockdown, then the lockdown has not been worth it. It's lower in terms of the values of life saved than the GDP cost if we take the very low figure of a statistical value of life. But it has been if we take probably, I suspect, a much more reasonable figure of the value of a statistical life for the UK, which is closer to the US figure. It has been worth it by some large amount, because the value of lives then at that higher figure would be estimated to be 1.14 trillion, and that far exceeds the GDP loss of about £500 billion pounds in the UK. So these are the types of calculations that might get us some way to say whether or not a lockdown has been useful or economically worthwhile in crude monetary terms, if we could value statistical lives in that way. There's no doubt about it that the hit to the GDP is extremely large, and these are the figures upon which that 25% average hit across countries GDP is based upon, coming from the OECD. The OECD, of course, are mainly interested in the high-income countries within the world. So this is the high-income economies are taking about a 25% hit across the board, some doing worse than others. In fact, yesterday it was just revealed that the US hit is probably higher and much more towards 30% rather than 25%. And of course, the hit in the GDP is spread across public sector and private sector. And here, again, by somewhere over 30% in all of these high-income countries. It's said that within the private consumption, within US consumption, about 40% of this overall fall, about 40% of the 30%, just about 40% of the overall fall in private consumption has occurred in the healthcare sector, as the healthcare providers have substituted fairly high-priced elective procedures to treat COVID-19 patients. That's quite interesting because within the hospital sector in the US, it looks as if somewhere around 40% of hospitals in the US are currently running deficits even before the COVID-19 pandemic took place. So that's a fairly large hit on the healthcare sector itself. This is a graph from Statistics and OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility in the UK, and it's looking at the percentage change year on year across GDP, so at national income from 1908. Here's the impact of the Spanish flu in the First World War, Second World War's impact, and as you can see, the year-on-year change in GDP, the impact is much higher than the 2008 financial crisis. I'll come back to that in a moment. And it's much higher than even the Spanish flu impact in terms of the 1 year impact of a fall in GDP. You can see here that the Spanish flu impact, it recovered quite quickly. This is just the GDP, UK GDP, so it's just to give a representation of the impact on one country's GDP. And the Office of Budget Responsibility, as I'll show you in a moment, and the ONS think that there's going to be a similar increase over a 1 year period. But the take-home point here is that, remember I said that the GDP fall would be about 25% in, according to the OECD. Here it's about 13%. So it may be an underestimate. But certainly there are differing estimates on the impact that the pandemic is going to have across individual countries. This may be an underestimate, but even if it is an underestimate, it's still the biggest change in fall in GDP in over a century. As a response, countries, again, the wealthier countries, the G20 countries, have responded to the coronavirus by pulling together, largely, it has to be said, individually within their countries, within their own countries. There's been some spillover in the European Union, for example, but generally speaking, it's country by country, as set out in this graph. There has been a public sector response, and in total, that accounts for about an $8 trillion response to fight the pandemic across these individual countries here. Here we have the percentage of GDP which is being attributed to the fight against the pandemic, and the blue lines, blue histograms, are essentially loan and equity injections. So they're actually not one-off payments, if you like, but they're loans to the private sector in particular, and some bond issues or equity issues, which again may be redeemed at the future. So Italy has a large loan and equity injection, but a very small fiscal and revenue expenditure injection as part of this global response of the $8 trillion. It also has other measures within the individual country which is undertaken. But these are obviously very large loan amounts, so the loans are dominating this bailout, if you like, bailout package agreed by the G20. Although in some countries, including Australia and the United States, there have been massive revenue expenditure measures. For example, everybody in the United States is going to receive approximately $1,200 as a means of trying to kickstart private consumption in the US again. $1,200 for 320 odd million individuals, obviously, is quite a large public sector undertaking. So there are some immediate responses to the pandemic. Because of those responses, that's going to add to global government debt. The global government debt, so the amount of debt that's held in the public sector by governments, that the responses are going to add approximately 10 to 12% of debt to each individual country's response. And on a year-on-year basis, the financial year 2020, for example, there's going to be more expenditure than tax revenue, for example, so that the fiscal balances are going to fall by about 6%. Now, these fiscal balances in the Eurozone are quite important. Remember that the Eurozone has this rule that the fiscal balances cannot go below 3%, so expenditure cannot be higher than 3% than the government revenues. So the fiscal balance overall cannot be in more than 3% deficit. But that rule, the Maastricht rule, has been broken already, with countries like Italy, for example, going into 7 or even 10% by some estimate deficits fiscally this year. So you've got the fiscal deficit, the year-on-year expenditure revenue by the individual public sector, and the cumulative debt over time. Cumulative debt is rising, and that's been added to by this mismatch between expenditure being larger than revenue as the COVID-19 crisis hits the economies through the lockdown. Now, as I said, what does that mean really sort of longer terms? So just to recap on what I have said, the COVID-19 looks as if it's plateauing as a pandemic. It looks as if we take the OECD figures, about 25% of countries' GDPs are there's going to be a 25% fall in countries' GDPs directly attributable to the lockdown associated with the pandemic. Is that lockdown worth it? Well, dependent on which value of a statistical life you take, it seems probable that given the death rate of 1%, case fatality rate of 1%, seems probable that the lockdown has been worth it in terms of the monetary value of life saved versus the monetary hit taken by the larger economies. And then longer term, what's going to happen? Well, although we've seen the largest fall in GDP annually since the beginning of the 20th century, a number of commentators, including the International Monetary Fund and the Office of for Budget Responsibility in the UK and the OECD, think there's going to be this uptick scenario whereby after a terrible 2020, in 2021, we see things start returning, growth rates start returning to normality. These are probably optimistic in my view anyway, with Brexit having an impact. I don't think the UK is going to see growth projections anywhere near 4%. But in any case, there's going to be a quick recovery. This is what a number of commentators say. On the other hand, this might not occur, of course. So why might it not occur? Well, it may well be that we have to see this medium-term effect of COVID and the debt increase, the government and public debt and private debt increase against a general growing background of global debt. So these two figures here show the percentage of world GDP from the 1970s through to 2018. So before the crisis, the pandemic hit, we can see total debt basically growing globally. That's split between private debt, which is larger than public debt or government debt. So we see both private and government debt essentially rising linearly over a 40, 50-year period. And now it's, globally, debt is recorded at around 230% of world GDP. So it's over twice the amount of money or GDP, gross domestic product, that is being made in aggregate by countries each year. And in the bottom figure, we have this for the high income countries. So exactly the same with the World Bank has aggregated up the percentage of GDP which the world richest countries see as having increasing debt since the 1970s. And you can see here, for example, the increasing debt level associated with the 2008 financial crisis, banking crisis. It's kind of leveled off because there was harsh austerity placed in most of the high-income countries to try to service debt levels rather than expand public expenditure more. And on this small schema here, you can see the percentage of gross government debt to GDP for these individual countries for 2020, estimated for 2020, taking account of the COVID-19 pandemic. So Japan will have a debt holding, public debt holding, which is 2.5 times larger than its national income. Italy will have a debt holding of about 155% of its national income, and even the UK, which after, if you think about it, 10 years of austerity and trying to get its debt levels down, and that's what the austerity was about, essentially, not increasing expenditure but trying to pay off its debts, will end up with, after the pandemic, a percentage of debt to GDP of about 95%. Germany, which has always tried to be a surplus country and has reduced wages, for example, in the past to maintain surpluses, has even it has a gross debt to GDP level, which is historically high for that country. So both private and public debt have been growing, and public debt in particular has been quite important since 2008-9 as growth has slowed across these countries due to the earlier crisis, the banking crisis. So I think there are basically going to be kind of two scenarios. This optimistic scenario is set out by some of the larger organizations. Ideas of a very quick uptake. You have the lockdown, there's pent-up, the lockdown's released, pent-up demand is released, aggregate demand takes off and recovers. We still have some quantitative easing and low interest rates associated with the banking crisis of 2008, with some idea that there's some liquidity crisis, but it's easing off. That tax rates will rise as general economic activity rises, with aggregate demand helping to ease the debt burden, therefore. That world trade under this optimistic scenario opens up again, and with world trades you're always going to have winners and losers, surplus and deficit countries. So in the past, the USA has been willing to fund debt through increases. I think that's changing now, obviously, with Trump saying that he doesn't want to buy Chinese goods, for example. And then under the last banking crisis, China undertook a huge spending package. In 2008, China released about 17% of its GDP through a monetary stimulus package. It essentially printed a lot of money and manipulated its exchange rates to try to get some growth back into the global economy. And then under this optimistic scenario, you'll also see Europe sees some increase in fiscal expansion, increase in government spending in particular. That's what they're currently arguing over. The Netherlands and Germany trying to not expand because if they take on fiscal expansion, essentially they're going to try to buy out the deficits of Southern Europe, and the Netherlands and Germany in particular kicking back against that. And as aggregate demand increases with the lag in investment, you might see too little money chasing too much money rather chasing too few goods, and therefore you get some inflation, and that inflation is a good thing because inflation without doing anything cuts your debt over time, but it has redistributive effects because basically the poor suffer more under inflation than the wealthy. And that's the optimistic scenario, right? So it may take some time, but there's this uptick as the pent-up demand's released. The global economy gets back to business as usual. Or you've got the pessimistic idea where essentially against that background that I've just shown you of increasing world debt, COVID-19 gives rise to this massive cash flow problem. Essentially, the lockdown has just stopped all economic activity, and in particular for the private sector, there's a massive cash flow problem. So one way out of that, as we've seen with the G20 $8 trillion packages, is to loan money to the private sector and or to put money into the economy generally as a government. So the public sector debt then rises even further to offset this. And it does it across the board. We've seen all these packages going out across the board. And that increases private sector indebtedness generally. And because it's across the board, it funds marginal firms, marginal private companies, who hold increasing, all private companies in holding more indebtedness. And the marginal ones are essentially those who would have gone bankrupt in any case, but are now being saved a little bit by more public money being pumped into the system, and then all of the survivors hold more debt. So the private sector's holding more debt because of these loan schemes, and the public sector's got more debt because it's had to initiate debt holdings to let the private sector borrow off the public sector. At the same time, we see increasing protectionism affecting the global economy, so that the US is no longer willing to fund increased consumption. It shuts down, tries to get a Buy American policy through its government. And China, which already has a growing debt burden, doesn't intervene with any large spending package. And Europe, again, with the South heavily indebted, the Northern Europeans don't really bail out the Southern Europeans, and there's growing debt within Europe generally. All of that underlying pessimistic idea relates to some notion that we're already in a liquidity trap. If you've seen the growth rates in debt, which I showed you in the earlier graphs, so that globally the world is holding about 2.5 times the world's GDP in debt already, and it's been increasing since the 1970s. So we've got a liquidity problem where the lenders of the money, private banks in particular, are only going to hold cash. They're not willing to spend or invest or even with interest rates being as low as they are, and in some countries are negative in real terms. So then so we've got this liquidity debt problem. The quantitative easing doesn't really increase aggregate demand as confidence is shaken. And essentially, the private sector, seeing its debt grow, tries to run down its debt rather than increase investment or go for growth. So employment falls and you get a fall in wages in particular. So debt grows with continued interest rates and continued low growth is the pessimistic view. Now, I think I tend more towards a pessimistic view because if you look at this graph of gross government debt, it was shown in the previous slide as a percentage of GDP. You can see that, as I said, since the 70s, it's been growing, right? Essentially growing. These were the naughty 90s, the good times, when there was a rundown in debt because essentially there was a boom globally, pretty much funded by China's expansion here. Not entirely, but Asian economies expansion. And then, of course, 2008 comes, again, we get increased debt levels associated with essentially quantitative easing. And here's the latest forecast of the impact that COVID is going to have on government debt. Okay, so the pessimism, I think, is possible because we've got these debt balances continuing to grow. We've got the private sector being bailed out of COVID across the board, but it ends up with them holding even higher debt levels than they had before. So you get low investment, but you've also got this against a background of protectionism. The richer countries may, of course, just print more money, quantitative easing, but in fact, it's not really had a huge impact, quantitative easing. We don't know what the counterfactual would have been, of course, but if you take the US between 2008 and 2011, they tripled the monetary base. The money supply went up by 3 times and it had no impact on prices, which is astonishing and could only have happened because of being in some form of liquidity trap, such that when people were the government was printing money, people were just hoarding it or holding onto the balances. You could try to increase your tax base to overcome these massive global public sector debt balances. How could we do that? We can't do it through employment taxes or income tax because there's been a big hit on our income. So we have to look at new tax bases. I propose that probably a wealth tax. A wealth tax isn't a bad thing because, remember, debt essentially moves everything forward. Once there is a true recovery, if there is a true recovery, or the younger generation, wealth is generally held by the older generation. So a wealth tax essentially helps you pay off your imbalances, helping directly future tax load burden on the younger people, but also allowing the younger people, in a sense, to gain from this intergenerational redistribution. You could go for more green taxes. The green taxes obviously are associated with environmental climate changes, or you could also have indirect taxes, sales taxes, which are generally regressive because if they're held and that level across all income groups, as we have with VAT in the UK at 20-odd%, it hits these taxes, indirect taxes, sales taxes, hit the poorer harder than the wealthier because the poorer's percentage spend of the budget is higher, they have less savings. But if you direct the indirect taxes onto conspicuous consumption, second homes, large cars, 2 cars, luxury goods, you could still raise some tax on the wealthy through a conspicuous consumption tax. But of course, all of that, even raising your tax base, may not be enough to offset the growth in the debt levels, which, as I say, are massive. 120% government debt is a percentage of GDP. That's more debt held by these wealthy countries than the advanced economies, so-called, than they're making each year in terms of their GDP. Why is it pessimistic? Because at the time that debt balances are growing, why am I pessimistic? At the time that debt balances are growing, It's at a time when real wages have been falling in any case. Here's the real wages, average weekly earnings from 2007 to 2018. You can see that after the banking crisis, they were falling in any case, and they've been falling longer. This is for the UK. They've been falling longer within the US than this, but they were falling for over a decade in the UK. And then, of course, there was a bit of a spurt of activity, again, funded largely through an increase in public sector debt, so that the real wage started to grow a little. But of course, in 2020, I think real wages are going to decline again. Productivity generally across countries has been sluggish, and growth rates have fallen from about 3 to 4% to about 2%, which are still high, but it's fairly low levels historically, recently, of GDP growth. We've got massive income inequalities in our high income countries. And so I don't think that increased taxes are going to be enough to offset debt. So we might, for example, have a positive inflation target. Some people have argued, some economists have argued that might help. So if we have an inflation target of about 4 to 6%, that might help kickstart some price increase and offset deflationary pressures which are associated with these debt balances. But it's just a target, it's nothing real. So it has to change expectations. Or you think that generally the COVID pandemic lockdown has essentially added to the liquidity trap and debt deflationary pressure, which is what I think. So I don't think there's going to be an immediate kickstart to the economy next year. I think there is a growing liquidity trap within globally within the advanced economies, and that of course knocks on to the other middle and low income economies. So in the longer term, how do we get out of this pessimism? How do we try to think about things which might try to make us feel a bit more optimistic? Well, in the longer term, and here I'm talking about 10 years down the track, I think we have to have greater fiscal stimulus. We have to have greater government spend. Okay. Now, of course, there's an inconsistency there. Why is he arguing for greater government spend if he's just told us that the debt levels are at their historically high levels? Well, in Japan, the debt to GDP ratio was about 250%. So 2.5, the debt is 2.5 times the annual GDP. But the way that the government has kept GDP growing is by having a massive fiscal stimulus, massive government spend to try to, especially in infrastructure investment programs, to try to keep the economy going. That, of course, will increase the fiscal deficit. It will, for sure, in Europe, break the Maastricht Agreement of a 3% budget deficit year-on-year restriction. It's already broken by Italy. I don't know how Italy are going to get out of this without some fiscal redistribution from the north. It also means probably more direct policy impact by the European Central Bank. So instead of really the Europeans looking to Germany and the Netherlands to bankroll through their surpluses the deficits in Southern Europe, there ought to be a formal reallocation of, in particular, fiscal stimulus through the European Bank, possibly through giving bigger rewards for long-term social investments. How would you do that? Well, you could, for example, cut the discount rates, public sector discount rates on investments, and that would stimulate more activity in the short term into social investments. You could still introduce wealth tax, green taxes, and indirect taxes on conspicuous consumption. And I think we also need a globally coordinated monopoly tax on the IT and data processing companies, the companies like Amazon, like Microsoft. Microsoft increased its profits by 40% over the last 2 years. But there's definitely a need for greater international cooperation, probably, and remember I'm talking long term here, a rollback of our harsh immigration policies to stop migrants coming into Europe or the States in particular, because if you get capital flows into these wealthy countries, and even although we have high levels of debt, we've still seen global capital flows into the US and Europe over the past 10 years. If you have more capital flows, that makes these countries wealthier than they otherwise would have been. And if you don't allow labour to follow the capital flows, then obviously the labour stuck at home is stuck at home in poorer countries. So I think we need a loosening of our migration policies. We need a greater role for MFF, the International Monetary Fund, to reallocate on a fiscal basis. We also need to get rid of these gigging labour markets, these short-term contracts in the labour markets, because that just increases uncertainties. We probably, I advocate over the longer term moving towards more company, private sector board participation for workers, a sort of Scandinavian type of world. Increase our vacations and our working week should be shorter, so that we get more enjoyment of relaxing as we're doing during the lockdown, rather than acquiring, so that we work slightly less, but possibly with not as large an impact on our productivity as you might expect. Accompany that by high green taxes and foreign travel, promote staycations, which have the additional benefit of reducing reliance on exports, so that you have more consumption at home, and also what's the last point I've made there? Oh yeah, we're going to see increases in pensionable ages, particularly in the private sector, and maybe because that's an across the board idea as well, you might want to have some targeting where you allow low-income pensioners back into the workforce rather than high-income pensioners. So I think all of these things are pretty radical, or they don't seem very radical to me, but quite radical. But it's the only way that you can change the social contract in a way that everybody benefits, in a way which I think is optimistic. Greater investment in health and social care sectors. The social care sector globally has taken a hit in the wealthy countries. That's where the largest deaths have been. We want more independent, non-political bodies to monitor public sector performance, so that it's not tied to public sector debt, but is tied to real performance outcomes. Change in public sector debt discount rates, as I said, lowering the discount rate in the public sector compared to the private sector, so that we get more investment in public sector near-term investments. How do we deal with catastrophes, global catastrophes? Well, it's obvious that these lockdowns are not a particularly sophisticated manner of dealing with them, but at the same time, the private insurance companies cannot deal with these catastrophes, so we need to have some public insurance fund, probably through some bond issue tied to catastrophes, to cover global catastrophes, pandemics, global warming damage, earthquakes. And also we have to incentivize pandemic vaccine research. Obviously, the problem with vaccine research in this area is that the timing and scale of the pandemics are uncertain, so private sector investors don't invest in the R&D because they don't know when demand's going to be realised. So we have to have some pre-commitment of public funding to vaccine research. All of that's my optimism, but of course we'll have to wait until this populist wave suffers a wipeout for any of these policies to be taken forward, because at present we've got what looks like a populist president for possibly another 5 years. We've certainly got populist governments in Europe who are going to carry us forward for the next 4 to 5 years. And with populism comes protectionism, and protectionism, of course, by reducing aggregate demand, will exacerbate all the pessimistic outcomes, which I see in the short to medium term. And in the short to medium term, I am pessimistic. I think that there's going to be no kickback. There's not going to be a release of pent-up demand from the short-term impact of the pandemic. We're going to see falling aggregate demand with higher debt economies, which largely means that we're going to have private sector companies trying to download their debt, offload their debt, get their debt levels down. That means no investments in the private sector. That means pressures to keep wages low, pressures to keep people on short-term contracts. In the public sector, I think we're also going to see periods of austerity unless Germany and the Netherlands change their moods quite dramatically. I can't see that the southern European countries doing particularly well in the next few years. Europe, of course, and its relationship with the UK is going to have an impact. So I think that we're still, even with massive quantitative easing, more money supply coming into the system, we're still going to see falling aggregate demand in the short to medium term. So I'm quite pessimistic short to medium term, but I think that it gives us scope at this point to think a bit outside of the box to try to coordinate some of the longer term visions that I've suggested. So